Ladies and gentlemen, people of all gender expressions, thank you for checking out the North Bank Media Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Strevens. Joining me on the show this afternoon was Dr. Arsh Khaira. Dr. Khaira holds a PhD in music from the University of Alberta. He also holds an MBA from the University of Alberta, as well as an MA from Concordia University. He's a professor and a scholar, having taught courses in music, religion, and business. He's a published author. His upcoming book, The Community of the Faithful, Jesus as a Personification of the Servant Israel, will be out later this year, published by Whitman Stock Publishers. As well, he is vice president of Prominent Homes, which is a home building company based in Edmonton. He's a man of many talents and a man who wears many hats. I should also say on top of that, he's a multi-instrumentalist musician. You can check out his music on his YouTube channel, which I'll post a link to in the show notes. I think we talked a little bit about that. Is like, well, there's a lot going on there, but maybe it's not so much wearing numerous hats as much as it is just toward a more pure or full self-expression, And I think that the interaction we had was probably a little bit what I would say professorial in nature, meaning, he spoke at length about a lot of things that I didn't have as much depth in as he did, and I was more than happy just to sort of listen and maneuver when necessary. And I think that's what I would have wanted from this podcast, really, from the start, was to hear from people who knew a lot more than me and who had a good grasp on things that I didn't. And that's where the enlightenment comes from for me personally anyway. So really enjoyed this one. A hell of a guy, very accomplished guy. Appreciate his time very much. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Arsh Khaira. Thank you for making time to do this, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. It's a privilege and an honor to share my work with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we should say there's a lot of work that you do that we should share. So one thing that occurred to me is maybe just give me a rundown of all the different work that you do, like just different mediums, different...
Sure. So my day job is I'm involved in the construction, new home building industry. Mm-hmm. So I do work with Prominent Homes, Edmonton. I also have a kind of a side gig with construction with the multi-unit projects, which is called ZAT Enterprises. So That's something that we started recently with the multi-unit. So that's my day job, construction, and that's when I do get out there with the hard hat and the PPE and the steel boots. And when I come home, I'm a musician, I'm a father, a scholar of religious studies and music. And music is probably the closest thing to my heart and to my soul, because it's something I've been involved in since I was very young. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the most, the most significant an important thing that I hold very close. So partial to that, I have a PhD in music from the University of Alberta, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through this discussion. And so other than that, I'm a father. I have 3 girls, so these are kind of the main things I'm involved in. There's some teaching and different hats that I wear, but primarily the day job is construction, and then music and scholarly work as well. So
right on. Well, people that listen to this will know that I'm fascinated by people like you who wear a lot of hats, and I guess I'm often finding myself asking, like, did you ever consider not wearing that many hats? Like, did it ever occur to you just to stick with the construction or just to do the music? Or
Well, I see with the construction, I mean, that's the day job and that's the daily bread. So that's how, we support our family, and we've been involved in construction. I mean, the family has been involved in construction, since the 80s.
Okay.
But in terms of my other interests, like in terms of music and scholarship and academia, I see those as all kind of being interconnected.
Okay.
So I see them, I mean, we can talk about, for example, like the humanities, so religious studies and music, history, even anthropology and these type of disciplines. So I do see those as all being kind of interconnected, and something that that I see they have a very close relationship to each other. So for me, the other side of my creative pursuit, in terms of scholarship and music, I see those all as being, very closely connected. And for example, my academic work, I feel like contributes to my creative work and my music as well. So I see those as being part and parcel with each other. So it's really it's not like a number of different hats, for example. It's actually like I have, my construction work, and then I have my creative work, which includes scholarship and music and interdisciplinary work. So I find that stuff is all very closely interconnected.
Okay, that's interesting. It's almost like to express yourself fully, you need to work in all these different ways.
Yes.
And it's maybe that's what it is, right? It's like it's just the self. That's the one thing that you're kind of pursuing
for
here.
sure. It's kind of like how theater, music, drama, poetry, storytelling, writing, these things are all kind of interconnected as humanities, as arts. So in that way, I see kind of my creative work as being all in kind of the same vein.
Okay, right on. Yeah, I think I would like to get there myself, but I find this is totally different from the video work that I do, and the songwriting is just another hat completely. But I like that. It's a path of least resistance to just doing what comes naturally.
Yeah, because like when we find like cohesion in the work that we do, or we find interconnectedness, like that contributes to like a kind of a harmony like within ourselves, so that we don't feel like we have, it doesn't feel like putting eggs in too many different baskets. It feels like, one kind of holistic pursuit.
Yes.
So I mean, the music is something that's so closely connected to my personality, and it affects the way that I see the world. So even when I'm, involved in construction, or I'm at the office, or doing financial work and this type of thing, the music is still there, it's something that drives me and motivates me, and it gives me energy. So this is something that is just like a very closely connected part of my personality. So.
Okay. And that was from a young age, you said, that music occurred to you, you had to do it? It was
very young age. So there's an interesting story, because when I was in... I had started begging my parents for an electric guitar by the time I was in like grade 3 or 4, and I had a couple uncles actually who played. So I had one uncle I remember, and he lived, I believe, in Saskatchewan somewhere, and he would come visit us once in a while, and he would play the guitar, and I would see him playing. And then I had another uncle from my grandmother's family. So my grandmother actually is from the former Yugoslavia. So she had, so Serbian, which is what the countries became divided, Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Croatia. So I had some relatives from her side that also played guitar. And so when I was in like grade 3, 4, I started begging my parents for a guitar. By grade 5, actually, my mother's brother, who at that time was probably in like his mid-20s, he was quite young, he became kind of terminally ill. And my parents went off to Toronto to go see him. And I remember that was sort of, November, December kind of the time. And so me and my sister were staying with my grandparents. And so my dad came back, probably like a few weeks before Christmas. And he said, okay, yeah, your uncle's, he's going to be okay. And so when he came back, I convinced him. So we went off to Heritage Mall, which is now destroyed.
Yeah.
But there was a store called Mr. Entertainment there.
Okay.
And so we picked up a guitar, electric guitar. It was an Aldigas guitar with a PV amp. And I came back, and then I remember like shortly after buying me that, my dad went back to Toronto, and then my uncle died. And I remember I spent a lot of time in my room just with my guitar. And so that kind of got it started. And then I remember that same year, there was a student in our class, young child, who actually, him and several members of his family also passed away in a traffic accident in the mountains. And I remember that again, I turned to my guitar. And by that time, I had learned a few different chords, you know, your E minors and G majors and a couple of like C's and D's. And I remember that a few of us kids from the class, and I was in grade 5 at the time, we wrote a song for him. And so music became something that was like very closely emotionally connected to me. And so by the time I got to grade 6, there were a couple of kids who had moved on to grade 7.
Sure.
And so I was in a band with them. And I remember back then, like this is like 94.
Okay.
So they used to call this, they used to call it Klondike Days. I don't know what they call it now.
K-Days now, I think.
Or something, yeah. So we performed there at a small kind of stage, like a little talent show kind of thing. And then I remember just playing at school and like playing, Oh Canada on my electric guitar in front of the school and stuff like that. So then by the time I got to junior high, I was like, okay, definitely I'm going to join concert band. And I became a percussionist in bands. So that got me started in drums.
Nice.
So by the time I was in like grade 7, 8, I was already kind of a multi-instrumentalist.
Yes,
and
sure.
So that's kind of how it got started. I can go on and on about this story, but
it's a cool story, man.
Yeah. So.
And it was just, and your parents never put up any resistance to it, like or did they?
No, at first there was, because nobody in my family is a musician, and they were wondering, like, once I started to show real growth and talent in music, like by the time I was in grade 8, I was a really good drummer.
Nice.
And I was quite a good guitar player, and we had already started a band. We had 3 of us from T.D. Baker Junior High there, and we had a band going. And so they supported me for sure. But they were kind of a little bit awestruck or mesmerized, like, where is this coming from? Like,
right.
But I remember back then, like, it was something like, growing up in that part of the city in the southeast there, like, these issues of like race and identity, like it was such a multicultural community, with people from Chile and Korea and
wow.
and different countries, and we all got along so well, and pretty much everybody was like into skateboarding or into like music, right. And around that time you had the Nirvanas and the Green Days on the radio, and the Smashing Pumpkins. And I remember my next door neighbor, he was probably like 4 or 5 years older than me. He was from Korea, and he was into electric guitar. So I used to sit with him on the front steps of the house there and just play guitar. And so yeah, that's kind of how it got started. But I mean, the issues of identity and who I was and these kind of things didn't really affect my music until I was in like grade 8 and 9, when I started getting bullied a little bit by kids in my school who were like, I remember some people from the same cultural community, they would say things to me like, oh, you're brown and you play guitar, like, who do you think you are, and stuff like that. Right. So these kind of things they did a little bit, but we were so into our music and so into concert band and into writing songs and all that we didn't let any of that faze us.
If you're enjoying this conversation, please subscribe on YouTube and give us a like. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. And now, back to the conversation. music seems to be a refugee, or a refuge, I should say, for people. And, that time in the early 90s, I'm a little younger than you, but the rise of grunge music and the rise of like skateboarding and skate videos, that was a revolutionary time.
Yeah.
And so to be that age at that time, it probably felt like you were part of something, riding a wave.
For sure. I remember like when they used to have at our school, like in grade 7 or 8, they used to have those Much Music video dance parties. Yes. And I remember we'd always be just kind of sitting off to the side or whatever, geeky music guys. Mm-hmm. But if they played like, Smells Like Teen Spirit or something, we'd just go and start jumping around like, funny kids. But yeah, no, that was a really special time to be involved in music. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, the music that came out at that time, you had like your Siamese Dream, and you had your Dookie with the Green Day and Nevermind, and before that even Bleach, and you had so many good albums, and even Alanis, she came out with Jagged Little Pill, and like all this really boundary pushing stuff. I mentioned these albums because these are albums like in those days you had a birthday party or something. Mm-hmm. People would go to like HMV or A&B Sound and they'd buy you like a cassette tape or later on a CD. Yep. Like that was like a typical birthday gift that you'd give somebody. They started with those Big Shiny Tunes albums. Oh, yeah. But no, that was really awesome to grow up around that time and be exposed to music. And I feel like we were lucky because we were in that generation when, these things were really blossoming and these things were really... the creativity and musical, the artistic element of the music was really, really like becoming huge at that time. And so I tried to stay as true to my generation as I can. Like I still mostly, if I'm listening to English music, I'll mostly listen to music from that generation, from the late 80s until like the mid to late 90s. And so typically what I try to do is
special guest.
Yeah, so I usually listen to music from that generation, and basically like music that kind of started to become popular like in the mid 2000s or a little bit later. Like I basically tried to completely tune out from that type of music because I felt that it didn't represent me or who I was or what I stood for musically. So I did listen to a lot of music, like new music around 2004, 5, and 6, like, a lot of the Canadian music that was coming out of Montreal and that type of thing. Your Arcade Fires and your Stills and Deers and Broken Social Scenes. And I used to go to a lot of shows because around that time I was like 19, 20 years old. So I saw a lot of these bands when they were just kind of starting up, like there's this music festival called Sasquatch that takes place out in George, Washington. There's a place called The Gorge in Seattle. And I remember I was like 20 years old. We went to the very first one, the very first Sasquatch, and we saw, Arcade Fire was there, the Deers were there. There were a lot of really popular bands. And I remember going and seeing, Feist when she first came out, and Broken Social Scene, Wolf Parade, all these like really awesome bands. And but once I started to sense that, things were becoming too digital, too processed, and too kind of, to me, it seemed fake. That's when I started to tune out. So, so right around the times of like the first, Strokes album and Killers and the first White Stripes album. So that was that to me represented like a change in music. And so I rode that wave for a while, but it didn't really fully resonate with my personality, and I felt that it wasn't true to who I was. So around that time, like 2007, 8, I stopped listening to new music. And so I haven't really exposed myself to any new music in the past like almost 10, 12, 15 years because I just felt alienated. I felt like I don't want to change with I want to be who I was, and I want to stay true to myself and my generation. And so it makes me think of like, Johnny Cash when he covered Hurt by 9 Inch Nails. And in that one line he goes, you're all somebody else, but I'm still right here. So these kind of things, like I took them really seriously, and I take my art and my music really seriously, that I try not to. I'm very careful about what I expose myself to and what I listen to and all of that. So yeah, this is kind of what has shaped me like to now. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And do you think there's a certain amount of like when it got to that period 2005, 6, 7, 8 where you were just kind of growing up and maturing a bit, so the angst of that music wasn't resonating with you?
Yeah, I feel like around that time, I was basically like 21, 22 years old when I started to tune out on all the new stuff. And I had really started to find myself. And around that time, I actually started getting more into music from my parents' culture, but even from that era, from that era, because after like 2007, 8, I stopped listening to new music from South Asia as well, whether it was Pakistan or Punjab or India or anywhere. But I do listen to a lot of world music now. Like I love listening to music from Mongolia or Ukraine or Israeli music, Russian music. I love listening to Chinese music and music from different countries. And so that's mostly what I listen to now, like whether it's like classical. But if I do listen to English music, it's going to be music that resonates with my soul and that represents like who I was. So I mostly do listen to like music from the late 80s until like the mid to late 90s, and then a little bit of stuff, every now and then I will throw on some music from like 2004, 5, 6, when a lot of those Canadian bands and like the first White Stripes or the early Strokes or Stills or the first Killers album, a lot of stuff like that. But I listen to Bleach a lot, the first Nirvana album. Some of the more modern stuff, like the early System of a Down, like your Mesmerize and Hypnotize, and then some of the earlier stuff, like for the heavier stuff, I do like the early like Disturbed and Drowning Pool, some of that type of stuff, or the early Lamb of God, stuff like that. But when it comes to like new stuff, I can quite proudly say that a lot of the artists now, I literally don't know any of their songs, and I'm so glad, because it means that when I go to my studio and when I set up the mics and when I power up my amps and all that, I know that what's gonna come out of my fingers and what's gonna come out of my throat and my voice is gonna represent me, and it's gonna represent like who I was and the things that really influenced and developed who I eventually became as an artist. So that's why I find like, in terms of consumption, so I do also have a marketing background. So I did an MBA from the University of Alberta, and I graduated in 2013. And a big part of that was to assist me with the construction and the home building industry. But I learned a lot about consumer behavior, about psychology, and about marketing, and about consumerism and consumption. So sometimes I do also write songs about how we consume, and I'm very careful myself also about how I consume, also the way, in terms of listening to music as well, I see also as a form of consumerism. And so I'm also very careful about what I'm taking in, what type of music and media I'm exposing myself to, whether it's like mainstream TV or whether it's mainstream music or radio and all that type of things. So I guess you can say from that perspective, I will vouch for myself and say I'm a legitimate, and I have street credibility as a real indie kind of,
Absolutely.
as a real indie
True
person, true indie. Yeah. Like I feel like I I do represent those values, and I try to follow, I go back to like the 60s and the Buffy St. Marie's
Sure.
and the Bob Dylans and this folk and the music, where, Joni Mitchell's Big Yellow Taxi and this idea of going against, consumerism
Sure.
and this type of thing. So a lot of my activism comes from there, but I really do try to practice what I preach and stay true to my art and really believe in the things that I write and so on. Yeah.
Right on. Well, that's great, and I find that fascinating. The way you say you sort of curate your influences, or you keep your field narrow, because it's just going to muddy what's going in. It's going to muddy what comes out of you. Yeah. I guess, and the same could be said about anything, right? Food, drink, whatever. You have to sort of limit it. I guess I wonder where I was going with that. It's because we're in a culture now where it's like it's endless scroll on your phone. The timeline never ends. And it's always, have you seen this? Have you heard this? It's like, no, I haven't, and I don't want to.
Well, to add to that, like when I was writing my PhD thesis in the music department, so I specialized in ethnomusicology. So that PhD took me about seven years to do, and I can honestly say that when I was writing my thesis, I didn't read anybody else's thesis. And I know a lot of people, when they're writing a thesis, they like to go through and see other people's theses. And a big part of that was that I don't want to be pulled even subconsciously in any other direction other than what I have envisioned. So yeah, in terms of what we take in and what we expose ourselves to, I do try to be, and I try to be a good Canadian too. So I try to, in terms of Canadian content and the things that we grew up with and a lot of that, because when I was in studying religion, also when I was studying music, I did have a lot of professors from America.
Okay.
So I had my PhD supervisor was from Boston, and then my other supervisor was from also another part of the United States, but obviously they had moved up here to Canada. And so, I found like a lot of the things I was talking about, and sometimes that they would say they would not really know like what I meant. And I had some early experiences, like when I was in grade 12, I did play high school football, and we went out to Sunny Hills, California to play against a team from there.
Okay.
And I remember how awestruck I was by this culture, like in California. Like it was so different. And I feel like we do have certain things that even as Albertans, like you can microscope in, right? Like as Canadians, we have things that set us apart, definitely from our neighbors. Then as Albertans, we have things that set us apart, but also as Edmontonians, we have our own unique way of doing things. Like, and you notice that sometimes when you go to Calgary or you go to another part of Alberta or of the country, like you feel a different energy and a different vibe. So yeah, in terms of being from Edmonton, like going from Canada to Alberta to Edmonton, I really do try to imbibe and be true to my roots as well. I was born at the Misericordia in 1984, and my dad originally came to Winnipeg in the mid 70s, but then he came up to Edmonton, I think around like 78. Okay. And so we've been kind of like vested in this community and in this city, from since I was born, right? So I never thought about going anywhere else to study. I never thought about going anywhere else. And I've been fortunate. I know a lot of people, they do have to, for opportunities and that type of thing, they have to see where they can find those opportunities. But we've been fortunate that way. But I feel like even now, like in Alberta, you have, people who want to come to Alberta, they want to come to Edmonton. And I remember back then the population of the city, like when I was a kid, it was like 300,000 or something. So it's and so many things have changed, and sometimes you do get lost in that nostalgia. And I would say some people might be critical of me and say I'm too much into nostalgia, and I'm too much into like the way things were. But I feel like that's a lot of that is just like holding on to your roots and your values, like a tree that has like deep roots, right? And so when I think about Edmonton and growing up, being part of like minor hockey, growing up in Edmonton from like the age of 6 until I was like in my 20s, or going to school and high school out here, and going to university out here, and seeing the way that the city has changed. There's something that about the way that we grew up in this city, and that our experiences and our friendships and that type of thing, that so I guess a big part of what I'm getting at, as I also mentioned with the music, is about staying true to ourselves, and not just not just blowing wherever,
wherever the wind goes today.
Yeah, it's about being like a firmly rooted and truly believing in your city, believing in your relationships and your friendships and your. When I say culture, I don't necessarily mean like culture in the sense of like the way like anthropologists understand culture, but I mean culture like in terms of like our kind of the cultural milieu, or the way we grew up as kids, And so a part of that would be like, the skateboarding and the music and these type of things. But a part of it is also how we connected to other kids when we were growing up, and, how those friendships kind of came forth and all of that. So from that point of view, like, I think Nickelback's a good band because I mean they're from Hanna, Alberta, and like
although they don't say that anymore.
I know they don't say. I know they moved out to Vancouver in California, but like I grew up listening to Wide Mouth Mason a lot, and they were from Saskatchewan, but I always felt a connection to them, because they were from the prairies, but I remember back then, like, we didn't have that many artists from Edmonton who really were becoming, successful. I remember when I was in high school, there was a young girl named Maren Ord.
Yeah, I remember that name.
So she was from Edmonton. I remember she was like one of the first people from here to go and get like a huge. But then, you had like your Social Codes and your Tupelo Honey. And I remember Social Code used to be called Fifth Season. They were from St. Albert. And so I remember they went out to California. They had like a major record deal and Tupelo Honeys. And there were a lot of bands like around that time when we were also doing a lot of gigging around like 2003, when we were playing at like the Sidetracks and the Urban Lounge and these type of places. And Reds was an old place that we used to play. So yeah, it was always nice to see, and in those days, I felt like you could actually dream about stuff like that, about taking your music. But now the way the industry has changed so much, like it's become so saturated, and it's become kind of So
well, there's something to be said for like. Now that the technology is so, I mean, look, a guy like me can now do a podcast. Whereas 10 years ago, I couldn't have done a radio show, really. And now it's like, well, anybody can do it. So like you say, the market is, it's saturated. Does that depress you a little bit? Does it just make you realize the music is just going to stay a hobby for me? Or
no, it's for me, it's not a hobby. It's a very deep part of my soul. But I feel like certain things, yes, they have made it a little bit easier for people like me and you. I can go to my basement and I can mic up my amps, and I can put together a pretty good recording just out of my basement. And I feel that from that point of view, it has made creativity and artistic expression a little bit more accessible. I never would have dreamed about being able to record songs by myself in my own studio. That was always something that you'd have to have a band and think about a budget and where are we going to go record. I remember back then in the 90s, there used to be a studio on White Ave there called B Scene Studios.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where I remember, like, we did our battle of the bands and stuff, and if you won, you'd win like studio time, right? And then you'd go and you'd be able to spend like a day at B Scene Studios and put together a demo. And I remember, things were a lot different. But now from that point of view, I love it. I think it's great that I can use the technology and the equipment that we have to do things, to have that creative process in my own hands.
For sure.
But to some extent, nobody buys albums anymore. Like, really,
Right.
I mean, a lot of people don't. And it's just become kind of a thing where, you miss that. You miss, like, buying a CD and like, you'd go through, you'd take out the liner notes and
Yes.
you'd read the lyrics and you'd read like the songwriting credits and all that. And so that part of it has kind of been lost. So I don't know if I would say for the most part, it's been a loss. I mean, we've suffered in terms of art and the real music and the real creativity, but we have gained some things. Like, we've
Right.
gained the ability to have more of the creative control and the ability to put together projects where we don't have to rely on putting together a huge budget and this type of thing. So from that point of view, it's become more accessible. But I'd love to see, and I believe that there are still a lot of really amazing creative people
Yep.
out there who are doing things. But to some extent, you have to look at the intention as well,
Yes.
right? Like, some people, they might just want to get like 1 million views or go viral or
Sure.
whatever, and it's not really like the content, or it's more of like the style over substance. But people
Right.
would argue that in the 80s, when MTV came out, that destroyed music too. I mean, each generation has
Works on
that
destroying
thing,
the culture.
That's how we know we're going in the next generation now, because
Right.
we're complaining.
Sure.
And I
Here we go.
remember the
Yep.
rockers from the 70s, they complained in the 80s that MTV has destroyed music.
Right.
And then in the 90s, the 80s musicians were complaining. And then in the 2000s, the 90s musicians. So
Right.
I feel like it might just be, the way that time changes.
Sure.
And, yeah.
Or how about when Bob Dylan went electric in
Electric,
'66 and
of course.
called him
Yeah.
Judas, as
Yeah.
if he was letting down the culture.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, with Bob Dylan and a lot of these musicians, because they, they did a lot of like groundbreaking things. I mean, like, for example, Jimmy playing the Star Spangled Banner. That there was a huge controversy about that, but he was so brilliant. He actually, when the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. So he's making the sound of rockets with his guitar, and he's even making the sound of like screaming and this type, and sirens, and a lot of people really came after him after that, what gave him the right to do that. But I feel like that's also a form of, protest, and a form of, anti-war and anti-conflict. And
Right.
so there's different ways that, when we talk about, when there's a conflict in the world, we talk about how like NATO or the United Nations or different countries, they mobilize, right? But we can also talk about, how artists mobilize. And so when we talk about, protesting, through music and creativity, you do go back to, the Buffy St. Marie's and, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Bob Dylan, or Where Have All the Flowers Gone, and the Pete Seegers, and, even Universal Soldier, Buffy St. Marie.
Sure.
But then even later, Rage Against the Machine, the front lines everywhere, there be no shelter here. But he's talking about, there's a line in that song where he says, trade in your history for a VCR. I know, like, now VCR sounds like outdated technology, but back then they were also going against this mass consumerism and this idea that, System of a Down, they have a lot of their songs on Hypnotize and Mesmerize, they say, for example, in one song they say, why don't you ask the kids at Tiananmen Square, is fashion the reason they were there? So, and a lot of that is relevant now too when we look at some of the protests, like with the Black Lives Matter and different protests taking place. That is a lot of it. Is it just fashion? Is it just like being seen at the right place at the right time? So there's also this idea of going against consumerism. And so then even later when you had protest music with like specific like bands from different parts of the world, like even going back to the Joshua Tree and U2 with Sunday Bloody Sunday, raising awareness about things that were happening in the world. Like person like me, I would have had no idea about what was happening in Northern Ireland if I had never heard of U2, or if I had never heard the Cranberries Zombie. If I had never heard those songs, I would never know. And so I would never have known about the Armenian genocide if it wasn't for System of a Down. So, or about things that are happening in Cuba or in Chile if it wasn't for Rage Against the Machine. So the musicians have some of them do show that they do have an onus of social responsibility when they're creating content that shows that that they do really care about the things that are happening in the world. Matthew Good was another good amazing example when
Canadian,
when he came out 10-20 years ago. Like a lot of his songs also showed that he cared. That the music had some of it was also anti-consumerism, some of his music about going against the industry and that type of thing, but a lot of his music was also like politically motivated as well. So,
and is that part of what drives you? Because a lot of your music, at least some of the stuff you showed me, your more recent stuff, is it's protest music or it's socially conscious. Is that you just see no other way?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I had started doing that when I was a teenager. I remember when I was around 18 years old, I had actually started writing songs that showed social, that I had like kind of this ability to empathize with different communities and to show like a social consciousness and awareness. And I remember like I used to kind of be kind of a more kind of artsy kind of person. That was the reason why I did sometimes have trouble with I could hold my own. I mean, I played hockey, I played football, but sometimes there was some kind of like pseudo psychological bullying and things like that that I had to deal with, especially like having the color of skin that I do. But sometimes like from my own community.
Really?
Yeah, mostly
because you
from
were
my
going
own
into some
community.
quote unquote white activities.
Yes, exactly. Then so most of the pushback was from my own community. I mean, from certain individuals. But I remember like I used to do interesting things with my clothes, and I remember writing on one pair of jeans that I had. Weapon of mass instruction, because that was when Saddam and the Kurdish genocide, and then they were saying that he had weapons of mass destruction, and so these things were coming, and that was also around September 11, when we were like 17, 18 years old, and these things kind of really all of a sudden showed like, okay, there was a huge paradigm shift, in the way that people saw the world and the way that all these things went. So, it was, it was really interesting to grow up in those times, but definitely like I showed, kind of inklings, or I showed kind of sparks of that type of creative ability, but definitely that creative ability to write music with a social consciousness or music that had like social awareness, that was really developed as I pursued my higher education. So when I studied religion, I remember I started writing a lot of songs about kind of the way religion is seen in the world, and a lot of the wars that were taking place around that time were based sort of on these ideas. And also when I did my PhD, a lot of my social consciousness was more activated. And that's when I started writing songs like Blood Diamonds and Smoke. And so these kind of things really were developed, and I would give a lot of the credit to my professors.
Okay.
So like Dr. Stephen Muir at Concordia, who, guided me through my religious studies work. And then Dr. Michael Frischkopf at the University of Alberta, who really shaped my ability to use music as a tool to elicit positive social change, because he himself had had a lot of experience using music to raise awareness about different social issues, whether it was like a shortage of water or even political issues. So when I wrote Blood Diamonds, right in kind of the thick of the time I was doing my PhD, I used this word or this phrase that was associated with a particular conflict, or the idea that in a particular part of West Africa, where a lot of these very, very, very valuable minerals and resources were coming from, that there were wars and there were conflict, and children were dying, right? And then we were selling those diamonds here in Canada, and people were buying them and wearing them. The same thing with cocoa, and the same thing with a lot of bottled water.
Lithium too, I think.
Lithium now definitely as well, and a lot of minerals. So this is kind of how my consciousness was shaped, and the ability to write songs that showed this type of, because I try to emphasize this idea of feeling empathy. And I remember, it might surprise you, but one of my biggest influences in songwriting is Kurt Cobain. And I felt like even from a young age, like I remember, because 94, the year I got my first guitar, was also the year he died. And I remember like I kind of had this, I felt like I had the ability to kind of see deeper into his lyrics and feel like kind of an understanding. And I really kind of tried to understand who he was and his passion for music. And I remember, he used to say things like peace, love, and empathy, and about the ability to feel for other people and this type of thing. So I guess a lot of that was shaped, in my early days. And I remember one of the very first songs that I ever wrote actually was a poem. It was a poem written by my sister, but that was one of the first poems that we had turned into a song for our band when we were back in grade 8. And that song was called Day by Day. And that song, it was like, the lyrics also represented this social consciousness, or this anti-war kind of idea, where she says, dust surrounds us as bullets fly by, so I duck and take cover as if it would help. Everywhere you look, corpses lie, surrounded by loved ones who will soon die. Soldiers come from far and wide to stop the violence, to stop the dying. Day by day, people cry. Day by day, people die. Nothing can be done, nothing will be done, wishing that trying would even help. Some risk their lives while others just run. Why can't something be done? So we used to sing that song.
That's heavy.
And I remember we recorded it on one of our demos too, like back in 98. And the interesting thing is that I had fallen out of touch, and that was our first band, and we stayed as a band, from grade 7 in like 1996, 97, 96 until like 2003, until we got to university, and then we all fell out of touch. There were just 3 of us in that band, and we went our separate ways, and we literally didn't talk for almost 20 years. But the funny thing was that my drummer, he messaged me this past summer.
Wow. And
so we started talking again after literally not talking, not saying a word for almost 20 years. And I remember he's like, let's re-record these songs.
Wow, that's incredible.
So we're re-recording like Day by Day, and a lot of those songs that and we used to perform a lot, like we used to do like all the, any battle of the bands or any kind of thing that would happen in Edmonton, we'd be involved in that. And I remember a lot of the bands, from that era, like, 97 to like, 2001, 2002, I remember a lot of those bands' names, and it was such a cool scene. I remember the first time that we played in a battle of the bands at McNally High School there. I remember opening the gym door. I was in grade 10, and we had already had our band going for about 3 years. And I remember opening the gym door and just looking inside, and I saw the stage and, big Marshall stacks and all
Yes.
that, and they had rented, and I was just blown away. I was like, we get to go stand on that stage and play music now. And so yeah, it's something that, it's really, really, deep. Like even the friendships and the way I remember, like, because the three of us in that band, we were called Broken Angel, and so we're kind of trying to re-record some of the songs now after, not talking for 20 years and getting back in touch. But the interesting thing was that the three of us were all first generation Canadians.
Okay.
So our bass player, his parents had moved from China, and our drummer, his parents had moved from Scotland.
Okay.
So we all had this kind of, our families were kind of, pretty much like there was some tradition and something going on there, and so the way we kind of all meshed together, and it was beyond color, it was beyond ethnicity. Like growing up in those days, like, you actually didn't see color. Like you actually didn't. Like you had so many different people from different communities, and it wasn't cliquey at all. It wasn't. And I remember seeing the change as I got to grade 12 and as I graduated and went to university, and I saw how the new generation, like it started to become kind of more cliquey and kind of more, like these are these people and these are these people and they do that and they do that.
Very
and
tribal.
we do that. Tribal, yeah. And I remember it was not like that at all when we were growing up. Yeah, because, we didn't see, like I said, I'd be playing guitar on the front steps of my neighbor's house who was from Korea, and then we had, my people from so many different countries, and Chile and even China and so many different countries, and even from like Bosnia. I remember my real kind of best friend in junior high was from Croatia, and maybe he had no idea that my grandmother was a Serb. So he probably didn't even know that, but somehow you just connect, you look at the person and
it's beyond that.
Yeah,
it's beyond race.
Yeah. And even from being from my parents having, a Punjabi background, like, these things, like, it was just like, but I didn't really start to feel that. But I can say that now, like, to some extent, I do feel that these things do matter more. I mean, like, they've become kind of an issue, and they weren't really an issue for me as a musician when I was growing up, but I thought I started to feel some of that after 9/11.
Yes.
Like,
that was a turning point.
Yeah, I started to feel it, and I never felt it before, but as I turned like 18, 19, 20 years old, I was still going up on stages. I was the front man in a rock band. And we were playing at, like, we were opening for good bands and stuff like that. And we were playing hard kind of grungy rock music. And I never felt it. But by the time I was like 20, I started feeling it. And I was like, you know what? I'm different. I actually started.
Never occurred to you before.
Yeah, it never occurred to me before.
Right.
And I started to feel it. And I was like, you know what?
Damn.
Maybe it matters. Maybe these things do matter, But
do you think they matter?
I try not to think about them, and I try to just see myself as a human being, and I try to just see myself as just a Canadian, as a regular person, and who's into all the, respects the Canadian culture and Canadian values. So I try not to think about it, and it's I could say it's kind of a double-edged sword, because there are moments when you do feel like, maybe what that person said to me, or maybe that person was rude to me because of the way I look. But those kind of things I never really thought about things that way before when I was growing up. But now sometimes it does kind of cross your mind that perhaps, but I usually just try to tell myself that no, it's not that, But I feel like, yeah, with a lot of the conflicts that have taken place in the world and a lot of this kind of, Western intervention in different countries.
Yeah.
I mean, this how Americans are so anti-communist, and when it comes to China or Cuba, or just even the involvement in Vietnam, like in the 60s. But I feel like those kind of conflicts where those have created a lot of tension and a lot of animosity. But yeah, it's not something I dwell over. I did write extensively about the idea of colonization, or the idea of how in my PhD research, I tried to explore how music could be used to reconcile communities or bring communities back together that were basically forcibly divided due to colonization. And these communities showed centuries of mutual cultural interdependence. So they were so interconnected, whether it was in West Africa or whether it was First Nations communities in North America or even in South Asia, how these communities, they lived side by side, and they were basically like so close to each other. And then basically you had the creation of new nation states, right. You had the creation of borders, and people just became enemies overnight, And I had this story on kind of my grandfather and my grandmother's side. So my grandfather, he was from a particular place, and then a border was created, so he had to get up and leave his homeland. And then the same thing with my grandmother, and they both tell me that the people we used to eat with and the people we used to play with, overnight we became enemies. And overnight communities were like trying to kill each other and saying, well, this is our land now, and you have to go there. And this idea of, so what I tried to do with my PhD is see how music could be used to bring those communities back together, bring communities that bring the current generations who I feel like have some of that residual intergenerational trauma has been passed down, and so bring those current generations back together and say that, our ancestors, they used to eat together, they shared together, they farmed together, they did everything together, they worked together. And because of colonization, me and you are from warring countries now.
Yeah.
Whether it's Nigeria and Ghana, Liberia, Togo, Sierra Leone, or whether it's India and Pakistan, or whether it's Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia.
Wow.
That now, that we used to be, our ancestors were together, they shared, and now, apparently you hate me because because our governments are fighting,
completely arbitrary and fabricated.
So I tried to see how music could bring these communities back together. So as a part of that, I did research in the Kashmir region, and I tried to explore that conflict there and how people were divided. I also attended a West African Pentecostal church for a couple months in Edmonton, where different nations, different people from West African nations would come together in one church, and they would sing in each other's languages.
Wow.
So they would have like, Ive is one of the languages, and now like the Ive tribe, they were, this kind of regional group of people who got divided across like 3 different borders.
Okay.
So now those people have their new national identities, right? So even though they used to all be Ive or Cree, now they're Nigerians, Ghanaians, Liberians, and they're fighting against each other over the control of blood diamonds or cocoa or water or lithium, as you said.
Sure.
So it was amazing to go there, and I interviewed a lot of people, and it was the same thing in Kashmir. I interviewed Pakistanis, and I interviewed people from India who were talking about the same thing, and even hearing stories from my grandpa or from my grandma about how, my grandpa says, oh, I had this friend and we were so close. And then overnight, the army trucks came.
Right.
They said, you guys are out of here. Like, we got to go now. Otherwise, there was so much loss of life. Like, so many hundreds of thousands of people died. And then grandma with the balkanization.
Sure.
It's the same story. Like, you hear the same story from First Nations communities. You hear the same story, all around the world.
Yep.
About how these things happened. And it's so I tried to see, even with Kurdish people, being from, caught in between, Iran and Iraq and Turkey and these areas, and there's just this story, like, and the idea of how the trauma gets passed down to future generations, because sometimes it doesn't click, but subconsciously, your grandpa says something to you, like when you're a kid, and he might repeat something a few times over and over, and then when you get older, you start thinking, like, why did he used to say that to me, or why did they used to say these things? And I feel like, it's the same thing. I mean, the Ukrainians had the Holodomor, and there was, Holocaust, and so many things happened, and even generations here. A lot of Canadians of European descent, their grandparents were in World War II, or they experienced, like, a lot of them were in camps, or a lot of them had to flee their homes, and a lot of the time we don't realize, but I try to tell my students too sometimes, who might be of European descent, is that your grandparents or your nana, she might say something to you, and it's not really going to click until you get a little bit older.
Sure.
And you remember, like, why did she used to say that? Or why did my grandpa used to say these things, And so I feel like music is so powerful, because music can be used to divide communities, like with propaganda.
For sure.
But it can also be used to bring people together. I know in the time of the Balkan War that each community, whether it was Serbs or Croats or Bosnians, they were making songs insulting the other groups, But then you also have this idea of singing songs to say that, even though you're on the other side of the border, we're brothers. Or, even though that, you have this background and I have that background, there's that idea as well. So music is so powerful.
Yes.
It can really mobilize. It can mobilize people to protest peacefully and advocate for empathy and compassion, but it can also make people do horrible things.
Definitely that. Do you think that a lot of that protest music originally, let's say in the 60s and then on through then, it was kind of always us versus the state? It was kind of raging against state control. And now we're being divided along a lot more, as they say, intersections and finer lines. And I don't wonder, I'm not trying to devalue that argument, but I often wonder if state control is kind of dependent on this, the way we're warring amongst each other over racial lines or gender lines, whatever. Do you think there's a place now for music to for protest music to almost reawaken people to, look, we are all essentially the same. Obviously, we're actually all different, but we're the same in that we're being governed by state mechanisms, and that over the course of doing this podcast, I guess I'm slowly becoming a Marxist, but what I find is I'm becoming more aware of the way in which it is us and the state, not me versus you so much.
Yeah. I think a lot of it depends on the generation of young Canadians right now who are like in that 15 to like 25 age range. And I do have a little bit of experience of working with that demographic as an instructor of religious studies, and also I've taught world music at the University of Alberta, as well as some marketing courses. But I feel like they are so important because they're the ones who are going to determine the future and what ends up happening. But definitely the idea of divide and rule, I mean, that's kind of a tried and tested true method of being able to consolidate control and power. And yeah, definitely I feel like to some extent we are becoming more and more divided. And I think, that's it might actually be something that's being done with a concerted and manipulative effort to actually, for certain people, to continue to consolidate control. Even with religion is used by so many different groups to extrinsically allow them to gain power. And so Michael Foucault writes about power and power dynamics, and how power works in the doxa and a field, or in the idea of how there's kind of this this idea of governance and police and authority, and how power is organized, and how it's diffused throughout society. But definitely, yeah, to some extent, we do need to come together. And it's interesting because, you had the Beatles even in the UK, and you had protest music in the 60s, and that did seem to make some type of positive effect in changing the overall attitudes of a lot of Americans. When you had the Joni Mitchells and the Bob Dylans and anti-Vietnam, and they didn't want to get involved. But I feel, music still has that power, but I feel like this current generation of young Canadians that we really need to speak to and get our music across to, the 15 to 25 demographic, is, I feel like my experience is that a lot of things for them are so kind of fast, and consumerism, as you said, the scrolling through, right? You've got your iPhones and you're just scrolling. And there's not a lot of patience or time to really, there's information overload, and kind of, so I feel like if we can try to go back to a more organic and more kind of, slow things down, and really look at, okay, what are the factors contributing to our division and divisions in society, and how we can really overcome those. And as you mentioned, Marxism, it's interesting because both my grandparents are very, very devout Marxists. I know my grandfather, he has written books on communism, and also from my mother's side, there's a lot of this idea of and Marxism or being a socialist does not necessarily mean that we have to, change our government to a communist government, because democracy is still kind of closely connected to socialism as well. But I feel like if we can take the humanitarian element of it, where we're seeing each other as equals and counterparts, I've had people in the music industry, in the local scene, who have referred to each other as comrade.
Okay.
So I know some people who have written articles about me and stuff, and I feel like they do get a sense of that element from songs like Blood Diamonds or Smoke, or some of the other songs I've written. So yeah, I feel like, and that idea is that of seeing each other as equals. But I feel like it's going to take a lot of effort with the younger generation, because, we, like, the older generations, of course, maybe they're also being divided to some extent, but a lot of that is also due to current, changes in the political sphere and the way that society has changed and evolved over time. But, I feel like some of the traditions and the values that, if we can listen to our elders with an open mind, and not, because they also had a lot of biases and a lot of, they came from countries, like, for example, that were at war with each other, But music, I think, I believe in it, and I stand by music. I stand by art and poetry and writing and storytelling, and I believe these are very, very powerful mediums that do have a very, very powerful potential to create positive social change in society. And that is something that, I knew I would never let go of, but having done a doctorate in music, now it's become not only something that's so deep in my soul that I can never really let go of, but something that I also, that is a part of my, you can say, like my physical or my paper identity. It's on paper that this is who I am. I mean, I knew it was in my soul, and I knew that it was something I would always stand by. But now it's like, it's something that's like a part of my, like, my civil or my civilian identity, if you will, as well. That it's written that this person has completed this type of training, so they're associated with this field. So I guess I've become kind of, you can say, on paper, I've become associated with that line of work as well. So whether, it was always something that I knew. And that's something as well, you mentioned that speaking to people who have, a day job and who are like involved in different industries contributing to society in Alberta and Edmonton, but that also have this passion for creativity or the arts or other areas. So, that's something that, I know, and I stand firm in that conviction that music and creativity and writing these type of songs and this type of music is something that I'm, very, very devoted to, and that, is not something that that I can ever remove from my
being.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think, and to be honest with you, I think maybe it's the only real thing is to work in media, to work in artistic expression. I think that, that's what we've been doing since the dawn of time. How else can we express these ideas in a way that the community can rally around them? Because if it's just inside you and you're thinking all these thoughts all day, well, what real good is that? But to put it into a medium like music is really, to me, the only way, or filmmaking or writing, whatever, poetry.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work, actually passion. So the word passion, I remember talking to a colleague of mine once at Concordia, and they mentioned that with the Latin root of passion, it actually comes from the term for suffering. So that's why they use the term, the passion of Christ, or the passion, which begins in Matthew 27, which talks about the arrest, the trial, the conviction, and the death of Jesus. So in terms of passion, like, this is something that does represent some element of suffering as well, right?
Yes.
And you've seen that the people who have been truly, truly committed to their work, they have tired themselves and they have really suffered endlessly for the sake of their conviction and for the sake of their art, or for the sake of their the works that they produce, right? So it's something that, when we look at passion, or that we look at our drive or our motivation, it's something that once it becomes kind of this intrinsically connected part of your being, it's something that it's so deeply entrenched in there, that that it's not something that you just kind of say as, something that you do just to pass the time, right?
Certainly not.
It's definitely much, much deeper than that. But the extent to which the works that you produce attain some type of, commercial or marketability, or that they reach, some level of that people are aware of your work and that they know about what you're doing. That's a really important part too, but that involves a different type of intellectual facility, because when you're creating and when you're, like, for example, writing poetry or writing books, you a lot of creative people, they don't have that side of their kind of talent or skill where they can get it out to the masses or get it out to people so people know about what they're doing and they can hear their ideas.
Right.
You know, but then there's some people now who maybe are creating more commercially viable music that is style over substance, who are basically marketers.
Yeah,
so they know how to get everything out there, but
and that's dangerous because the ideas that can be hidden in those flashy, easy to consume pieces can be destructive. It's a lot of maybe promiscuity or kind of the breakdown of the family or me or just hustle, whatever it is.
Yes.
A lot of it's egotistical,
Yeah. It's hard to be, you have to find a balance. I mean, you have to be able to go out there and, put yourself out there, right? Because otherwise it's a vain pursuit where you're just doing all this work and you're working tirelessly and aimlessly, but nobody's taking notice, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have a balance of that as well, where you're able to tell people about what it is you do and share your work, but definitely being a true artist as well, or true to your convictions, is also something that I feel is not. I mean, you don't see it as much, where people are literally dying for their, for their work and their music. But as sad as the 90s were, I mean, you've got the 27 Club, and you've got your Cobains and your Elliott Smiths and your Chris Cornells and your Lane Steelys and all these people.
Scott
Weiland, of course. Yeah, it's but to some extent that's also, people being taken advantage of, and people being the industry being so kind of cutthroat and what it is. So it's striking a balance of the ability to be indie and to be an activist, but also to have your message and your creative works reach people,
Right.
And that's something that community is so important, right? So having a community and being able to share your ideas and be able to connect with other people at a creative level, and also at a level where you see the benefit in someone else's success, where you actually feel positive and you actually feel good about other people being heard and getting their creative works out there. So that camaraderie, right?
Yep.
So
Camaraderie, yeah. Watch out for the root of that word.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
So I guess like when we talk about intersectionalism and this sort of real progressive dividing up of the people, if you could say anything about it, it also is leading to tolerance between groups, and it is leading to that community. Really strong community bonds are being built around different parts of identity that we had before. I guess... Do you see a way forward then? Obviously, I know you would say it's music, but is there a way forward in our thinking, maybe in a religious way, where we can start to uplift people in a real way?
Yeah, I mean, also as a part of that kind of communist or Marxist approach is that I know my grandfather, as a devout Marxist, he kind of he says he's an atheist, but I feel like religion is something that it's a private and it's a personal thing. So if we look at the gospel, Jesus says not to be like the scribes and Pharisees who want the best seats in the synagogue. They pray on the street corner. They want everybody to know their charitable deeds. But he says, when you give charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. When you pray, go to your room, close the door, and in private, in silence, pray to your Father, right, in heaven. So I feel like it's something that should be, that we should keep like as a personal thing, like that's a personal relationship between however we understand that relationship. Like some people, they resonate more with different religious philosophies, but it's something that I feel it's a really positive thing that if in society, we're secular or
Yep.
kind of like that socialist kind of thing, but that we have our beliefs and our convictions and our spirituality like in private, and it's not something that that's kind of how I see it. If I take that idea from the gospel. So there's also this idea that when he goes into the temple and he turns over all the money changers' tables and he says, "It is written that my house should be a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den of thieves." So this is the idea that he's criticizing, and this was 2,000 years ago, right?
Right,
So,
right.
I mean, to what extent we can see also now the way today that a lot of religious leaders and a lot of these things that they don't necessarily represent the values that the original prophets or the original teachers were actually trying to get across to us,
Okay.
right? So that's how I see it, that, I am, I do believe in God, and I do live with kind of this idea that, that we should be good people and treat each other with respect. The greatest commandment is to love your neighbor. So I feel like, yeah, that's a really important thing. But I also feel like it's something that, I feel like it's something that is best left like as a private
Interesting.
and personal thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like when we go in silence and not necessarily on this side of the road or.
Well, yeah, fair enough. Although there is a guy who preaches on the corner on White Avenue.
Yeah, I know.
He might be kind of doing the wrong.
Yeah.
So, but as our society moves towards secularity, and we're starting to see this, maybe it's always been there, where this egotism and this greed and all these sins, for lack of a better word, take over. Is there a way that we can? Okay, fine. The teachings don't have to come from up there, but is there a way that we can bring those values back a little bit?
I feel like we are returning to some extent. I feel like families now, they do want their kids and they do want some of the more traditional, the idea of the home fire or the idea of the idea of family. And, there's a song that I listen to a lot by a band from the 80s called Cutting Crew. So there's a song called The Scattering, where they talk about the idea of people leaving, of children leaving home. It's from like a farming community,
Okay.
but the idea of, that boys and girls will see in time that they were wrong to go. If skies could fall with harvest rain, then one by one they'd come home. So it's this idea of, people from small rural farming communities, they want to move to the cities, and increasing, modernization and awareness and this type of thing. But I feel like there, people that eventually there will be so much static and so much white noise out there in the world that people will long for some type of peace and some type of this kind of inner, peace and solitude that they'll only find in certain ways. And I feel like people, they do want to return to that type of thing, whether it's traditional values. And when I talk about traditional culture, I don't necessarily mean from a particular community, but even the values of family structure and this type of thing, that of mutual respect. And John Lennon talks about it, but John Lennon again with Imagine, right? He's saying imagine no religion, imagine no heaven and no hell.
But what did he propose as the solution then in that song?
Well, he's saying, imagine there's no countries, nothing to live or die for, a brotherhood of humanity. Imagine everyone living for today, and imagine everyone living in peace.
Right.
So for some people, it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular religion that brings them to feel compassion and empathy, or that brings them inner peace. It can also be this kind of idea from, like, Imagine, like John Lennon, like he's talking about a brotherhood of humanity.
Right.
And so the idea that imagine everyone living as one, imagine everyone living for today, imagine no possession, right? So these are ideas that sound really utopian,
Sure.
but to some extent that, those songs and those type of poetry, those do allow us to envision the potential of humankind, where there's a mutual respect for and a tolerance for each other's beliefs and convictions, but at the same time, there's this idea that as a society as a whole, we want the greater good. We want people to respect and tolerate and feel kindness for each other, right? So dogmatism and this type of thing is also, counterproductive, because I feel like that divides as well, right? So I feel like the idea of the religious traditions, the great religious traditions in the world, was not to divide, was to, bring people together. So I feel like there has to be a mutual tolerance and respect, but it's also something that I feel is best kept in the private sphere.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's a great way to look at it. I mean, can you hold your beliefs in private and then go out and into the world and act them?
Yes.
Is that maybe the move?
Of course, yeah. I mean, the idea of from the Protestant faith, which is what I studied quite extensively at Concordia, is the idea of manifesting oneself in good works. So you let your works represent goodness and righteousness. So the idea that you become a vicar of God's will. So God, by His grace, gives you your faith and your conviction so that you can go out into the world and do good works, and have the fruits of your labor. For example, I'm going back to the Bible again because of my training, and because of my educational training. But when Jesus sees I believe it's a fig tree that is not bearing fruit, and they say, well, let's cut it down and let's throw it into the fire because it's not bearing good fruit.
Right.
But if you dig around it and you give it good soil and you water it, let's see next year, maybe then it will give fruit, and give it another year. Then eventually that tree will also bear forth good fruit, right? So I guess like the fig tree, that we're known by the fruits, by our works. So that the idea is that the fruit is our works and our good deeds. So
but that also seems to represent a certain amount of having to have patience and having to put ourselves in the right conditions to be good.
Yeah. But I feel like a lot of patience and a lot of our ability to have to not, the society has become such a pressure cooker. It's such a pressure cooker society that to have patience, we also have to be very careful about what we're consuming.
Yes.
So I go back to the idea of marketing and consumer behavior and psychology, that essentially, even in terms of religion, or even in terms of food, or in terms of music and media and books, we have to put a concerted effort into thinking about what we're consuming, because eventually what's consuming, right? Then those things will imbibe and start to show signs of those things about everything we're taking in, right? So if we can start to put more thought into, what we're exposing ourselves to, and in terms of media, and in terms of the shows we watch and the music we listen to, and the things we eat and drink, and maybe those decisions will allow us to have more patience in the long term. because when everything is so fleeting, everything is so quick, we want everything right away. We go through our phones and we go through our social media and all that, and we want to have everything quick, right?
Yep.
So that represents a lack of patience as well. Before, people would have to, you remember the people used to come selling the encyclopedias to our house, and they would sell like 30 books of the encyclopedia, and you literally had to have, A through C, D through F, and we had to go into a book, or you had to find somebody who was knowledgeable in that field and ask them. You would actually have value for your teachers or your instructors. You would ask them. But now, because of the instant information, everybody's kind of an expert, in everything.
Or we're tricked into thinking that you used to go to the movie theater and they play the newsreel first before the movie. You get your news once a week. And now, like you say, pressure cooker's a great word, but it's also like my friend says, microwave. It's just quick. Just give it to me.
Yeah. No, that's true. Like, I feel like with the patience, it's everything. Like, even if we look at, hockey now, like hockey used to be such a beautiful game. Like, you remember the Mario Lemieux and the Bobby Orrs. It has become so violent. And even you look at some of the things when they're, even this mixed martial arts and this thing where they're beating each other, the living daylights out of each other, and people are cheering like so loud. It's barbaric,
it is.
And we wonder, like, okay, like what are we exposing ourselves to, and where, these things are going to have some type of subliminal effect on the way we act and see the world,
Yeah. Although I don't think that mixed martial arts is too different from the gladiators of old.
Yeah, it's like the gladiators thing too, and I mean, like, it's something that, there's so many things that I'm not saying that, that we need to stop sport and stop, martial arts and this type of thing. But I feel like we need to bring back the mutual respect and the camaraderie and the idea of having, this idea of, it's kind of hard to describe, because I do see it in multiple levels in society, but it's I don't have enough. I don't feel like I can say, like, give a proper comment on that, because the way I live my life and the things I expose myself to, I don't want to put conditions on anybody else and say that if you want to be a good human being, don't watch mixed martial arts. Or if you want to be a good human being, don't do this, because that's not for me to say, and that's not my right to say anything like that. But I feel like, for me personally, I can talk to my own personal experience and say that I try to really kind of moderate what I'm taking in, and hopefully, through that, I allow myself to feel compassion and empathy for my fellow human being. But I'm nowhere near a perfect person at all, But I feel like perhaps, that there's certain changes we can make in the way we live our lives that maybe can contribute to us seeing each other with more tolerance, compassion, and respect. And maybe I could say that from the perspective of a scholar.
Sure.
Not as like a preacher or anybody like that, or a spiritual guide or anything, which is not anything what I am. I'm a musician and a scholar and a songwriter, but I feel like from what I've read, there's a song from my parents' culture And in that song it says, "My friend, if you have read 4 books, I have a lot of questions to ask you." But what it's saying is, if you've read a few books, like if you are a learned man, if you
Sure.
are an educated man who can read and write, and it's coming from the perspective of a villager.
Okay.
That, my friend, if you have read a few books, I have so many questions to ask you, right? So, yeah, it's not to say that, that I have any authority to say that, this is the way that people should live, but perhaps, we all have ideas, and if we can come to some type of mutual understanding and say that, these are the things that are important to me, and these are the things that I think that society should represent as a whole. But yeah, I feel like there's so much division, and there's so much frustration and anger that people are really hesitant and really they're really skeptical about anybody who, and it's the same thing with religion as well. If anybody talks about religion, people tend to be really skeptical, and they usually think that there's some underlying motive, or that there's some extrinsically motivated desire to obtain some type of power or control. But I feel like even in religion, there are a lot of beautiful ideas, whether we go to the Bible, but even in the Islamic tradition and the Jewish tradition, there are a lot of beautiful, beautiful ideas. So there's so much out there for us to gain insight from and to learn from. And, it's, but, it's up to every individual to determine what, their path is. So I feel like if we can give each other the space and the time and the respect, and respect each other's beliefs, I feel like that would allow us to definitely make a lot of progress as a society as a whole.
Couldn't have said it better. Dr. Khaira, you've got a book coming out, is that correct?
Yes. So my book is coming out by an American publisher called Whip and Stock. And right now it's in the copy editing phase. So that book should probably come out in about 3 to 4 months, I would assume would be the timeline.
Okay.
That is a biblical studies book, the title of the book is The Community of the Faithful, Jesus as a Personification of Servant Israel. So that book represents my research. In biblical studies, we call it exegesis, which is when we look at prophetic scripture and we try to use historical context and history to determine what the relevance and what those scriptures really mean. And of course, a lot of it seems subjective, but we try to be as scientific and as critical as possible in this type of study. So what I've done is I've taken a look at 2 of the exilic prophets from the Old Testament, Isaiah and Daniel, and I've looked at their prophecies where each one of them has described a singular person. Isaiah describes the suffering servant as somebody who suffers on behalf of others. So one of the scriptures from Isaiah 53 is, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten before God, and afflicted. He was wounded for the sake of our transgressions. He was bruised for the sake of our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace is upon him, and by his stripes we are healed." So he is describing a singular person who suffers on behalf of others. Then Daniel in chapter 7 has a dream where he also sees what he describes as a singular person. But in this situation, this singular person who he describes as the Son of Man has a position of glory and respect and authority. So he describes how he sees 4 different beasts, and after those beasts, he says, "And behold, in my vision, I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and great glory." So these 2 singular individuals or singular people that both Isaiah and Daniel describe in their prophecies were interpreted later by Christians as messianic prophecies pointing to the Messiah Jesus. So Christians would say that the one who suffers on behalf of others is Jesus. And like a lamb being led to slaughter, he's quiet and he says nothing. And Daniel's vision of the Son of Man, Christians would say, represents Jesus in his enthronement in heaven after his resurrection. But the Jewish interpretation of those prophecies says that the singular person who Isaiah describes as a suffering servant represents a singular personification of the nation Israel.
Okay.
So that Israel is suffering on behalf of others. And when Daniel describes the coming of the Son of Man with great power and glory, the Jewish interpretation is that this represents the reconciliation and the restoration of Israel as the light to the nations, as God's elect. So what I try to do in this book is take the 2 prophecies, the Jewish and the Christian, and try to reconcile them and say that you can have the traditional Jewish interpretation reconciled with the traditional Christian theological interpretation if we say that Jesus, as a Jew from first century Israel, from the line of David, understood what the prophets meant, and he himself was the singular personification of the nation of Israel. So when Jesus suffers and dies after his trial and execution, that this is as a representative of that suffering servant of Isaiah as the singular personification of Israel. And Jesus' enthronement after his resurrection, as with the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, also represents the restoration and exaltation of Israel, as Jesus is a singular personification of that entire nation. So in the book, I go through in very much detail based on the scriptures and based on the Old Testament as well as from the Gospel of Matthew. So I try to explore this concept, and I try to explore the idea of how one man can singularly personify an entire nation, or can come to represent the singular embodiment or singular personification of an entire community of people. And then the next stage of interpretation in that is that I show that as Jesus singularly personified Israel, now the church, or the community of the faithful, as the book is called, they collectively personify Jesus. So you have a nation personified by an individual, personified by a nation. So that the church represents the physical presence. When I say church, I don't necessarily mean a particular denomination or a particular group. I mean those people who truly embody and represent the physical presence of the Messiah on earth, so that his second coming, or as they call in biblical studies, parousia, is manifested through the presence of his disciples or his people on earth who represent his physical presence by teaching, proclaiming, healing, and acting out as kind and compassionate human beings on earth. So they represent, as a collective, his physical presence. So that's what I try to explain in this book.
That's wild. You did a good job of it here. I feel like I've read the book.
Yeah.
And what was that process like? How many years of research went into that?
That took a lot of research. So from 2006 until 2012, 6 years, 7 years, I studied the Bible very closely when I was studying at Concordia. I also did study the other Abrahamic faiths as well, including Judaism. I've studied Islam very closely as well. But definitely this book is from a biblical studies perspective and represents that side of my training. My PhD thesis looked very closely at Islam and Sufism and mystical forms of Islam with Sufi poetry. And so that's another side of my religious studies training. So this ability that I developed through the course of my academic training to see the different Abrahamic faiths through a unique perceptual lens was one of the reasons that I did teach religion at Concordia for about 4 years. So I was teaching the Abrahamic faiths, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So,
And this interpretation of Jesus as, I'm not going to try and you just said it so well, but do you think that is that implied in the Bible? Or is that something that required a sort of, supplementary research to get there?
So what we talk about in biblical studies is the idea of hermeneutics. And the way it's typically described is that you have an onion, and as you peel, you have different layers of the onion, right? So the more you understand the historical context and this type of thing, the deeper you can go into your interpretation and analysis of who this historical person was, right? Who lived in the first century, and how he's represented in the Gospels. So yeah, it definitely it's definitely like a critical analysis, which would not be for like. You'd have to have some kind of knowledge, I think, of the scriptures, because typically, like when we look at organized religion or institutional religions, the emphasis is usually just on faith. So we don't give. There's a huge field of biblical scholarship and a lot of people who try to go really, really deeply into understanding. But most biblical scholars do have a particular area that they specialize in. So my area that I specialized in was typically eschatology, which is known as the end of times. So the second coming and this type of thing, as well as the exilic prophets, so the Jewish prophets during the exile to Babylon. So I looked very, very closely at the Jewish roots of Christianity and the idea of Jesus as a first century Jewish historical figure. So this is the kind of thing with eschatology. You have scriptures like Matthew 24. Where Jesus talks about the second coming, and he says that it's kind of this, people also describe it as apocalypse or apocalypticism. So Matthew talks about how the sun and the moon will be dark and the stars will fall from the sky and the heavens will shake and this type of thing. So this idea of the parousia or the second coming, apocalypticism, eschatology, I've looked at in quite a bit of detail, as well as the Jewish roots. So the gospel that I focus on mostly in my research is Matthew, and because Matthew has the strongest correlation to the Jewish prophets and to the Old Testament and that interconnectedness. Like when you look at the idea of Christology, so Christology is the idea of the study of the divine nature of Jesus.
Okay.
So John would be the highest in Christology, where he's seen as being the Son of God and the Christ and this type of idea. But Matthew, which is the first gospel, and John is the fourth. So Matthew would be the lowest in Christology, where Matthew sees him as a Jewish man, as the Messiah, as a prophet, as somebody who comes to suffer and die on behalf of his nation. So there's different perspectives, definitely. But this is one kind of perspective, and I feel like I offer a unique insight into this as, as I feel like I do have some objectivity when I'm studying this, because I'm not a Christian. So I feel like I didn't grow up going to church, or I didn't grow up, doing any of these things. So I feel like my perspective is unique, and that I can offer kind of an interesting and informed way of looking at my interpretation of who this person was, having studied the Bible extensively from a kind of scholarly or academic lens.
Okay, seeing it more as a text than as some sort of historical record.
I do see it as a historical record, definitely. I definitely do see it as having a lot of historical authenticity. So definitely, but when I say not a Christian, I mean somebody that was not raised in a particular denomination, or with dogma, or with, going to a particular denomination of church or anything like that. But definitely this person, this historical Jesus, speaks to me in a profound way. That I can say without a doubt. Having studied him so closely for so many years, and having written about him, I'm completely, mystified and captivated by who this person was. So from that point of view, I feel like I offer kind of a unique perspective on that.
No, totally. I think that's refreshing to hear that you can be interested in the text of the Bible and who Christ was, without having to make the leap of faith and be a real Christian. Yeah. Well, I know we're getting to the end of our time here, but Dr. Khaira, that was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
What's the best way if people want to read your works?
So please go to www.arshkhaira.com, ARSHKHAIRA.com. And from there you can see my music and my YouTube channel, and definitely my book will come out in a few months. And also with my music, I do have new music that I'm working on currently as well. So I would also really appreciate if listeners could subscribe to my YouTube channel, which they can also access from my website. And it's basically just youtube.com/c/Arsh Khaira. And I would really appreciate the support. And thank you so much, Patrick, for this amazing interview. I really appreciate you taking the time to help me get my work out to people.
Pleasure.
And it's a huge help to me, and I really very much appreciate it. So thank you so much for everything.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And hey, this is just the first of a couple things we might do together. So
thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the North Bank Media Podcast. If you enjoy this conversation, please subscribe on YouTube and give us a like. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe as well and leave a 5-star review.